Welcome to this discussion on using technology to prepare for Brexit. I'm Andy Wishart. I'm Global Head of Contract Express at Thomson Reuters. I'm a legal technologist with a special A in contract automation. I've been helping law firms and in-house legal teams use contract automation to speed up their contracting processes.
I'm Alistair Maiden. I'm a freelance legal engineer. Until recently, I was head of the contracts team at Asda, and before that I was the data protection officer. At Asda, I helped Asda to use a variety of technology to solve some of its legal problems.
So, Alistair, there's a lot of content online across a multitude of resources from organizations like Thomson Reuters and also law firms to help in-house legal teams prepare for Brexit. What's your advice at this stage for in-house lawyers in their preparation for Brexit?
I'm mindful that in-house legal teams will be under a lot of pressure from their colleagues and particularly the executive board to deliver answers on Brexit. I'm sure many GCs across the land are being asked the question, what are we doing about Brexit? And I think there's a danger of immediately launching into a time-consuming and expensive exercise to try and address a problem that, if we're honest, we probably don't know the full extent of at the moment. We don't know exactly how laws are going to change. We don't know how, for example, that's going to impact on our contractual positions. And I think an essential starting point at this stage is merely to be able to understand and keep track of how the laws are going to change. There's not going to be an immediate kind of Brexit day where the fog lifts and suddenly we know exactly how the new laws are going to affect our position.
So what resources are available on services like Practical Law and Westlaw right now to help with that preparation, perhaps across specific industries or specific areas of the law that might be subject to change following a Brexit event?
Yeah, I think practical laws are a useful source of reliable information, both by subject area and also by sector. So, be it financial and other commercial sectors. There's a lot of detailed information on there about specifically how Brexit is evolving and also how it might affect a particular area in which a legal team is focused. I think Westlaw also has a Brexit tracker. That's a really useful tool because it will automatically keep subscribers updated on changes, which is really useful because I think the key thing from Brexit is legal teams are going to need as much time as possible to make changes necessary to deal with the adverse effects of Brexit. I think getting that kind of instantaneous notification is going to be really useful in helping teams prepare.
There are a lot of similar events, I'm thinking about in the banking sector recently with the change in regulation that's resulted in the repapering of ISDA agreements.
Yeah.
And it seems like that Brexit could have a similar impact upon commercial contracts, that there may be a need to renegotiate or in some cases repaper. I know within the practical law, when speaking to the practical law product teams, there's a lot of interest in the Brexit clauses. Should in-house legal teams be looking to put a Brexit clause into their agreement, and what would a Brexit clause actually help them with right now, in your opinion?
Yeah, I think Brexit clauses are interesting because from my perspective, there's certainly not going to be a silver bullet for all the problems arising from Brexit. So in broad terms, I see a Brexit clause as being a kind of force majeure clause specifically for Brexit. So if triggered, it would prompt the parties to probably enter into discussions about how Brexit has affected the agreement. It may set a time period for which those discussions would be resolved, and the parties would agree how to change the agreement to reflect Brexit. And then if the parties couldn't agree on a course of action or a variation to the agreement, it might, for example, refer the matter to some kind of independent adjudicator or arbitrator, etc., to determine the issue. That's kind of, I would suggest, is a market fair Brexit clause. You might conversely, depending on your negotiating position, have a unilateral right to vary the contract, for example, to increase the price of services or goods if your supply is affected by Brexit. From a practical perspective, it really depends what you can get away with. Obviously, the ideal position is as much flexibility as possible, and if you can change a contract without having to consult the other side, that's really helpful. But if I was acting for a party faced with such a clause, I would strongly recommend against accepting it. And I think in-house lawyers need to be practical and mindful of the impact upon relationships with customers or suppliers in seeking to impose such a clause. And I think more fundamentally than that, actually, a real practical step that I've been advising clients, and I think it is kind of maybe more effective than a Brexit clause, is simply to, on a contract by contract basis, consider limiting the term to which my clients are committed. The reason being is, while it's quite easy, if for example you have a unilateral right to terminate a contract on, say, 6 months' notice, then if during that period of supply and receipt of goods, Brexit does start to adversely impact upon the commercial viability of the arrangement, then it enables you to simply either terminate the agreement or use the right to terminate the agreement as an incentive to bring your customer or supplier to the table and negotiate a fair deal. Conversely, if you're locked into a 5-year fixed-term contract, even if you have a Brexit clause in there, you're going to need to, probably go through quite an extensive legal exercise to actually invoke that clause and utilise it to your advantage. And
that legal exercise, so once the fog lifts a little bit and there's clarity over the impact that Brexit will perhaps have on commercial contracts, it's going to be necessary for in-house legal teams to move fast with speed and with accuracy. And in many ways, their renegotiation power might be determined by the speed at which they could react to Brexit. And I think that's where technology comes into play. For many in-house legal teams, a lot of them don't know exactly what's in their contracts. They may not even know exactly where their contracts are, never mind what clauses are in them. So, I see technology playing a major role in preparing for Brexit.
Yeah, I fundamentally agree with that. I think, in my experience, although most GCs probably wouldn't admit it to their board, I think
yes.
The truth is most in-house legal teams would have a difficult time putting their hands on all their contracts, never mind kind of realising any meaningful data from them. And I think, to be able to act swiftly and flexibly to deal with the problems, as you say, when the fog lifts, it's really important to know your position as a starting point. I know that you've been looking at some technologies and some services that could help with that.
Yeah, so I think finding and understanding all of the existing contracts that an organisation has in place, and perhaps identifying those contracts with clauses, be it governing law clauses or for example, a franchise agreement or a software license agreement that is restricted to a particular EU geographic location.
Yeah.
Finding those contracts and understanding the risk and the exposure can be a big task. There are certainly services available to help in-house legal teams to analyze those contracts, and that might be using a legal process outsourcing organization or a service provider to locate the contracts, to profile those contracts in a digital way, to understand the clauses, to quantify the clauses, and to store that in a centralized contract automation solution. And it seems to me that the things that in-house counsel should be doing right now is stepping up their efforts and use Brexit as a means to get the ship in order, to bring those contracts together into a central repository, to at that point be ready for preparing for potential repapering, potential renegotiation of those contracts. But the first step has got to be, where are they, what's in them, and which parties do they relate to?
Yeah, I think it's really challenging to move forward unless you know your current position. That certainly in my experience, that's always been the case. And I think if you you want to get bang for your buck and return on your investment, you really need to be very specific about what your objectives are, what your strategy is going to be to deal with those objectives. And I think the first technology's certainly been very useful to me in terms of collating data, getting it into one place, and then once I have that information, probably helping me determine my objectives and strategy as a starting point. I think as legal engineers, we can really help with that, being the interface between technology and the law. There's a lot of noise out there about technology and AI, and I think some of it slightly confuses the issue. And I also think there's a lot of traditional consultancies who are quite happy to come in and spend a lot of time and resource and effort to tell you what you need to do about Brexit. I think legal engineers can help because they're often lawyers or ex-lawyers who can really kind of have an implicit understanding of some of the legal challenges that you're going to face as an in-house legal team, and also give you a realistic view on what you can achieve, I guess. And then I think it's really important to select the right technologies for your business. I really think, for example, one of the key things that we've discussed in the past is, I think for an in-house legal team, realistically, they're rarely going to be at the front of the IT queue. So to be able to have software as a service that you can access via a cloud, that you can just switch on and use, is absolutely fundamental.
And again, sort of ties in with that need to move quickly, with the ability to turn on a cloud service instantly without having to bring in the IT department, I think is a really critical enabler of moving quickly. Now, you mentioned AI technologies. I'm interested in how AI technologies can assist legal teams with finding those contracts and analyzing those contracts to extract data. There are a number of solutions on the market. Kira, for example, based out of Toronto, have some machine learning technology that can interpret a contract, can use models that will learn to find particular clauses within contracts and then summarize that information to the lawyers. So that could help service providers who, so if an in-house legal team are outsourcing, finding all of the information in their existing contracts to service providers, be it law firms or to service providers like Thomson Reuters, they can use technologies like Kira to be able to analyze that information and to find those contracts quicker. Similar with solutions like Raven, based out of London. Those technologies are abstracting contractual data, are able to place that contractual data into a centralized repository that gives an understanding of where the contracts are today and with which entities, under which jurisdictions, and which clauses are contained within those contracts. And I think that's the work that should be done now to get everything in order, ready for the next stage in Brexit, which might then be repapering.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think that the main point that I'd like to make, I think these technologies are absolutely fantastic, but I still think there's a human element behind operationalizing them in a business. And, that's probably a mixture between, legal engineering services, which might help define your objectives and your strategy and your tactics and really harness and use these technologies in the right way. But also those kind of legal managed service providers who might be able to help you implement some of the findings from technologies. I think that's a really good segue into talking about contract automation technology as well. In terms of, once you have established, I guess, what you need to do, I think it's going to be absolutely vital to act quickly. Using automation technology for big bulk exercises, for example, if you found that you needed to vary several hundred contracts really quickly, I think that can give you a real advantage and a first mover advantage as well.
In many ways, I see. I mentioned earlier the repapering.
Yeah.
Almost as a sort of microcosm or a pretest for financial institutions to get ready for Brexit. A big regulatory change that has required many of them to use technologies to understand and analyze those existing ISDA agreements. It will be interesting to see what impact Brexit will have, say, on that particular industry and even on those types of agreements.
Yeah.
But it's almost in my mind that they've gone through a regulatory change that ought to help them prepare better for the next big regulatory change. So if you think about AI technologies like Kira and Raven, being able to analyze unstructured contracts that might be really bad images of a photograph of a contract, and bringing them into a structured world. The repapering exercise, which is the next stage, ought to stay structured, that data will remain within a repository, that the repapered provisions will be stored in a structured data way. So I think there's an opportunity in some sectors that have already gone through regulatory change to be able to act quicker than those that have not. Because they're already in a structured world. They're making use of contract automation technologies that they can then literally push a button to modify or create an amendment to those agreements with certainty, to be able to.
Yeah, and I think.
Go ahead.
I think it's probably just worth, on a basic level, explaining how that would work because, I think the great advantage of contract automation technology is you only have to do the work once, basically.
Yes.
So once you've used Kira and Raven or a legal managed service to identify the points of a contract that you might need to, or a bulk of contracts that you might need to change, once effectively, as you said, once you've coded the system, the contract automation system, at the push of a button, you could create multiple hundreds of letters of variation, which could then be digitally sent to the other side, could be digitally signed, and then could come back into your central repository. And so you've got, if you compare that to a kind of traditional legal methodology, that's obviously going to be much faster and more efficient. And also, just kind of considering the human side of it, if I've been working using a traditional legal methodology on 200 letters of variation, which were exactly the same, I think it'd have probably driven me to despair. Whereas you can actually, that kind of repetitive bulk work, the ability to do that quickly, efficiently, is really powerful. And then just to follow up something that you're kind of hinting at earlier, I think using contract automation technology is a really useful way of creating data that down the line, every action that you take within the system creates metadata that in the future, if we're faced with another equivalent of Brexit, could be really helpful to be able to help a business understand their contractual position without having to go to without having to launch a project or get external consultants in or outsource to a law firm or a legal managed service provider or use a technology. It would already be there on your system. You'd be able to report on it. You'd be able to pinpoint exactly what you wanted by using enhanced search functionality. And I think that'll be really powerful moving forward.
So a positive of Brexit is that it could potentially be pushing legal departments to be in greater control of their contracts.
Well, I think absolutely. I mean, if ever there was a golden opportunity to go to the business and ask for more legal budget, it's Brexit, isn't it? And I think, there is a real advantage of using technology in a business. I think, traditionally the legal department of a business, as I said before, has been at the back of the IT queue. It's not really seen as innovative. It sits in a bit of an ivory tower. But to be able to go to the business and say, what we've found, rather than spending a great deal of money dealing with this in a traditional way, we actually want to use some new, very innovative technology, potentially using AI, to address this problem. And in doing so, we're going to deal with it quickly and efficiently and cheaply, and we're also going to deliver a sustainable solution that puts us in a much better place for the future, not just for Brexit, but for any other issues that come along.
That's fantastic. Thanks. Some great ideas there. So I hope that this session has been useful to start in-house legal teams thinking about how technology could be used for Brexit. I think for me, one of the key takeaways is around there are things that in-house legal teams could be doing now, which is understanding where your contracts are, using technology to find those contracts, to analyze those contracts, to systematize those contracts, to be ready to move fast when the fog lifts.
Thank you.